Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this might be the longest episode of On the Pulse I have assembled thus far. Somehow I got through 11 albums this week, and yet the bizarre thing was that I was actually able to get ahead of my writing pretty quickly. So either I was organized and on top of things for once, or hell, maybe these albums were just easier to write about as a whole. Anyway, I'm not complaining, and let's not waste time because there's a lot here on the Pulse. So as I've said, I've got 11 albums on the docket here, but first let's go back a couple weeks and talk about from Hail Spirit Noir, Eden in Reverse. It's funny, I had the plan to cover this a while back, even with the beginnings of a review and everything, and then it literally took so long for the lyrics to come out properly that I dropped the album from my schedule. But the lyrics got released, now this is back, and to discuss Hail Spirit Noir, well, the first question is pinning down what the hell they even are. Hailing from Macedonia, on the surface they're a particularly weird blur of melodic black metal with vintage psychedelic prog rock, and what's more alarming is how tuneful and genuinely sticky a lot of their material is, well, providing you get past some of the goofier clean singing. Honestly, I kinda dug how on 2016's Mayhem in Blue, they brought in some surf rock guitar passages and distinctly late 60s, early 70s brand of psychedelia to augment some of their demented energy, and that album was a lot of fun. And it's a shame they don't really have that to the same degree here, as Hail Spirit Noir basically chose to ditch even more of their black metal elements for a thicker baritone and a more late 70s, early 80s analog synth-accented prog rock approach. Now this might be where some of the inevitable Opeth comparisons leap to the forefront, at least with their progression as a band, but thankfully Hail Spirit Noir kept enough burly tunefulness and a synth palette that probably even mows a little more to an act like Arion, with a mix that gives some of the kick drums and bass some echoing menace, while the guitars and the synth lines do have a lot of color and flair. That being said, this is an album I've been listening to for more than a couple weeks now, and I keep coming back to the feeling I should like this really way more than I do. Part of this comes with the black metal passages only really showing up on the first tape on New Earth. Some of it comes from some weirdly inconsistent drum production, which is a surprising issue for this band. And then there's the feeling, for as psychedelic and weird as Eden in Reverse is trying to be, in both the sound, the delivery, and some of the content, there's something that's a little bit too measured about it. The vocals are always very sober, and while the arc of the album might seem neat, starting from the human ideas of evolution and science, and then going in a mad chase backwards through time, and then all knowledge to uncover the roots of any sort of god, only to be savagely smacked back by human frailty and the ineffable omnipotence at the very core. I gotta say, it's not an unfamiliar set of themes in black metal or prog metal. In the Woods did something very similar on Pure back in 2016. Now, I definitely think if you can get into this brand of prog that's flush with more analog tones, you're gonna like this, but I'll also say it doesn't quite have the momentum or punch of Mayhem in Blue, and at the end of the day, just leaves me a little colder than I would like. Still a strong 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. It is interesting. Next up from Fontaines D.C, A Hero's Death.
Life ain't always empty. Life ain't always empty.
So this is also one of those acts I'm actually a little bit pleased I'll have a chance to talk about. The patron who originally requested this dropped out, but then somebody re-added the album, so alright, Fontaines D.C, they fall into some interesting territory. Kinda reminiscent of the more refined and polished post-punk you got in the early to mid-80s, with some splashes of new wave and some sharper song construction, maybe even a smattering of the post-punk revival of bands like Interpol, but Fontaines D.C keeping a lot of that hard-edged Irish political angle that helped their debut Doggerel turns out to be pretty damn good. Whereas, I find their sophomore album a bit tougher to gauge. It's darker, it's a little rougher, certainly more dreary and less catchy as it doubles down on a grayscale post-punk tone that matches a lot of the desperation of the band that's now trying to claw away from falling into isolation and despair in the face of any newfound success that they were not expecting, which then parallels some larger societal issues. And what I appreciate about Fontaines D.C. is that that they're at least trying to be optimistic in their fighting, and while the suffocating clouds of distorted guitars seem purpose-built to suck all that life away, I do appreciate how the group will walk the tightrope of wanting to buck against that system, have that punk side, but also highlight the very real social and psychological consequences that might come with that fight, which might not even be that far removed from a similar loneliness that can occur in succeeding under capitalism when you might wind up burning the candles at both ends. But I also appreciate that Fontaines D.C. get how much of that complicated emotionality in their art and in that struggle will matter. And this gives it a core that I really appreciate, that's desperately fighting against a sound with some oddly thin drums that wants to make this more dreary and less interesting than it is. Which, yes, is the overall point that comes with this sort of systemic oppression, and I think that the dynamic bass and guitar work can make for some cool tones if you like this brand of retro post-punk, but I don't think it always flatters their strongest tunes, and that can make the album feel a little less distinctive than Doggerel was. You've heard a lot of these smoked out tones and retro post-punk before, and I'm not quite hearing the shining hooks or the sheer vocal intensity to knock this into greatness. So it's still very good, but not quite great, so strong 7 out of 10. If you're into some smart, emotionally driven post-punk, this will probably be up your alley. Check it out. Next up from Jaye Jayle, Prisyn.
That's what I'm in.
If I describe the sound of this act, it might make you want to check him out immediately. A goth country act that pulls heavily on post-punk and no-wave with a quaking baritone, the sort of material that might play in a haunted, abandoned graveyard in the middle of a desert. And you know what? I'll admit that the atmosphere on that debut was enough to rope me in with Jaye Jayle, but going on to his third album, I wanted to get a deeper sense of what was actually being done with all that atmosphere, what he was trying to say. Well, sadly, he hasn't really stuck with the countryside, instead embracing increasingly colder synths and electronics, and pulling together a vocal delivery and a cadence that owes way too much to Nick Cave than he'll let on. But alright, maybe something closer to the early post-punk Nick Cave years. Maybe even meeting some of the more surreal stuff he's been doing in the 2010s? Well, not really, because it falls into the weird space of not quite being surreal enough to be truly unsettling or thought-provoking in its imagery, but also not having enough of a textural edge or a real crescendo to intimidate me. Indeed, I would argue that the oddly crunchy drum machines are awkwardly placed alongside some of the oily synths and the vocals, which more often than not will fade into the background. They don't really command the mix. And I don't think the writing's all that great either. It feels like a second or third draft would have really fleshed out some of the no-wave passages beyond a mantra, and while the themes on the surface seem kind of intriguing, more of a prison of one's own mind than anything in a forbidding and haunted world, well, take a step back and many of these scenes seem like kind of disconnected, isolated spats of weirdness from where he's just traveled around the world. Blueberries is probably the weirdest moment here, but even that metaphor surrounding a trade of a cloud of ageless skin feels more trying to be provocative in its passing exchange of song rather than coming by it naturally, which contributes to an album that's trying really hard to be moody and creepy, but ultimately doesn't even wind up all that oblique or ominous, just kind of gets a bit tedious. I'll be honest, I like the country-leaning projects more from Jaye Jayle, but this was at least somewhat interesting for what it was. Just felt weirdly abbreviated and thin, and didn't quite coalesce, so very strong 5 out of 10, but you might want to check it out anyway. There's gonna be an audience. Next up from Stand Atlantic, Pink Elephant. So it's a bad sign when the most I remember about your pop-punk act is that your frontwoman vaguely sounds like one of those super polished teenage boys that fronted the pop-punk wave in the mid-2000s, and that your sound is just as forgettable coming from that era. I said this back in my Neck Deep review a few weeks ago, but acts like this are completely tedious for me to review, because not only did I grow up with the genuine article, I actually did grow up, whereas many of these bands feel perpetually adolescent and rarely have the distinctive hooks or punch or writing to really stand out. so they come across as kind of derivative. And Stand Atlantic is absolutely in that pile. I found their debut utterly interchangeable, and now on their sophomore album, well, it's got a bit more personality, but mostly through choices I find really frustrating. I'd say it reminds me a little of Water Parks and some of their poppier elements, but Water Parks could at least craft a dynamic or magnetic hook, whereas Stand Atlantic sound like they cribbed a lot of their synth mixing and their vocal compression from the late 2000s, and no, that is not a compliment. The vocal mixing is by far the worst part of this album. And what's crazy is that you would think by going so often to chunky riffs and sharper percussion, they even sneak in a trap hi-hat onto Silken Satin, that they would have a more defined low-end bass line or bass groove, but too many of these songs wind up sounding really stiff and overblown, without any sort of broader melodic contrast or development to really drive a strong crescendo, or even help individual songs stand out with better hooks, which is what you want in pop punk. Honestly, I kind of feel bad for frontwoman Bonnie Fraser trying to holler through all this, but truth be told, she's not exactly a particularly dynamic performer herself, which means that all amidst all the teenage angst, there's not much in the way of cutting or distinctive detail that sticks with me, and very little the bouncy major chord pop punk that matches it. It leads to a project that is full force way too often, but somehow missing any sort of impact, either thanks to a lacking low end, a singer that's clawing through a lot of vocal overproduction, ugly synths that add nothing, and writing that does not match any of the tone, and it leads to a mess. 4 out of 10, can't recommend. Next up from Lil Keed, Trapped on Cleveland 3. When you were down, you were trying to stick around, you was in my home. Heard you was up, but I don't want no friend, you call my phone. I'm honestly surprised I don't get more trap mixtapes that show up on my schedule. I mean, I can repeat a lot of what I would normally say about one to another week after week, especially on Billboard Breakdown, and you wouldn't miss much. And Lil Keed is sadly a prime example of it. I've been vaguely aware of this guy for a bit through his ties to Young Thug's label and 300, but I haven't had anything to really say about him because I haven't heard what made him all that distinctive or interesting in terms of his flow or his sound. And on this hour-long mixtape as studio album, we get pretty much all the same. What's frustrating is that he imitates a lot of Young Thug's more frustrating elements, a lot of empty flexing and brand name porn that's passing off as content, a lot of forced rhymes, the swampy bass mixing against some bleeping synths, the washed out guitars, and the very thin trap drum machines, not nearly enough real ideas to sustain a stream-trolling 19-song album. But he also has few of the parts that make Young Thug distinctive, like the organic yowls and the completely over-the-top subject matter. Hell, when he tries to make some of his sex rhymes over the top, he just gets kind of juvenile. Or really just kind of gross. And while I'm sure the audience won't care if it bangs hard enough, how many distinctive hooks are we actually getting here, in comparison with a newer crop of artists like Roddy Ricch, who will switch up his flow a lot more often, or even Lil Baby, who is trying to get more mature? So this would be where I would go to the guest appearances, or just find the scattered bangers that somehow work. Well, outside of Young Thug and Gunna sounding like they'd rather be anywhere else, and I can't blame them, and Lil Baby once again sleepwalking through his verse, I actually think the Travis Scott of all people kind of snapped on the Wavy remix that's included, and Future did what he needed to on Zaza. And outside of that, Cold World is okay off of some of the howling guitars. I think the closer here has a pretty solid humid vibe with some of the more textured percussion. And I'll say this, the thicker cushion of synth behind Heartbreaker, it's a more distinctive and potent trap banger than frankly anything Lil Keed has ever made. Maybe it's a little bit more basic in the content, but it's got personality and color in the production. It actually stands out. The rest though, look, you've heard more than a few albums like this over the past 5 years. This does not stand out. It's not good even to boot. So, light 4 to 10, move on. Next up from the Microphones in 2020.
Keep on not dying, the sun keeps on rising.
Okay, look, I've tried with Phil Elverum music more than once at this point. I've tried with Mount Eerie, I tried with the black metal projects, and now going back to his seminal lo-fi records from the late 90s, his work once again does very little for me. Sure, there are some okay textures and guitar passages, but he is a flat vocal presence for me, and I was even less gripped by his content. It's clear he has grown as a songwriter since then, but it makes those early projects just not stand out for me. It's not like going back to old lo-fi Mountain Goats albums, where the writing was consistently punching above and being a little bit more distinctive. But, well, Phil Aviram called back the microphones for a single 40-plus minute song for this album, and to the surprise of nobody, it's kind of a bit tough to talk about. I'll say this, the way I tend to judge a single song project is similar to how I would judge a very long take in a movie. You're making a statement by not cutting away, so how a song like this uses negative space and transitions and crescendos really matters, especially if you're trying to cultivate any sense of tension or hold the audience's interest. And while you could argue the song becomes kind of melodically stale somewhere in the first 6 minutes of acoustic guitar before any sort of vocals, I will say there's enough splashes of piano, ragged electric guitar, hints of drums, and even some elongated distortion to at least mark time within the piece. Not so much multiple movements, so much as points that'll snap you back awake. And I will say that is part of the appeal of this song as well. It's meditative, it's faded, it's urging your mind to wander amidst its discomforting intimacy, leave you very few options but yearning for Phil Aviram's voice in a lot of his writing, which is not a good sign that I'm only really interested in one of those things. Look, I said this back when I reviewed Mount Eerie in 2017, but I don't find Phil Aviram engaging as a singer in any of his delivery. He's flat, he's not particularly expressive, the few bits of multi-tracking don't add that much, and he doesn't have a unique cadence or flair in his free verse that will draw you back towards the eccentricities of his poetry. So it's all the more frustrating going through the actual content here and realizing that Phil Aviram's larger point is to observe the disordered chaos of life, the cycles that only are assigned meaning by their repetition, then scrabble through past events and old songs to find fragments of truth and tranquility, which he does see in odd, ramshackle sequences. Again, it fits the album. He gets cuts like from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, an old Mayhem song, the primal force of the weather around him, even fragments of words from microphone sets amidst all the feedback. Nothing has ever quite been learned for him. Wisdom has come through repetition and observation and the great absurdity of trying to capture a moment in time, which means that this album isn't really so much wistful or nostalgic as it is just capturing those interchangeable nuggets of time, but it's only the moment that has ever actually mattered, and then placing them all in some sequence might bring some greater transcendence. And another comparison with film, it reminds me a lot of the existentialist themes that Richard Linklater was exploring on Waking Light, which is a really good movie, check it out. But the truth about this brand of observational writing is that if you're not captivated by the more revelatory moments, or you're impressed by their flattening or placing them all in context together, you might wind up feeling a bit distant. And as I see and get the appeal of this, I'm once again on the outside looking in on this one. It's just not for me, which is why I'm giving this a solid 6 out of 10. And a quote from an Arion song, The Sixth Extinction, from 01011001, sung by the late Steve Lee. The meaning of life is to give life meaning. Now that's a moment of transcendence I can actually replay. Just saying. Next up, from Deep Purple, Whoosh. Okay, I thought after Infinite, Deep Purple were done. It was a great finale album. It did exactly what it needed to do to send the band off. And while I still like Now What a bit more, it was exactly as solid as it needed to be. So obviously we got an encore coming with this. And well, Deep Purple themselves described this album as just cutting loose even further, trying to lean more into their psychedelic and prog tendencies that have been coming out in the past 10 years. But I'll say this again, Now What was a high watermark for that sound from this band that I'm not sure Whoosh can really beat. And like with Infinite, it kind of feels overpolished, a little lacking in punch, and patchy outside of specific songs, especially in nearly every keyboard choice outside of the organ. But really, it's kind of tough to say a lot lot more about a Deep Purple album at this stage. A heavier blues influence courtesy of the organs and the grooves. You're going to get a couple of really cool guitar solos and organ solos and some decent hooks, and I definitely appreciate them covering And the Address, the opening instrumental of their debut album, so maybe this is them coming full circle in their career encore? But that's the weird thing about Whoosh. It feels like a tacked on encore that I'm not going to complain about, good for them, but they already kind of had the finale vibe on the last album, and this isn't really passing it, especially when their weirder experiments like Step by Step, The Power of the Moon, and Man Alive, they're really not all that challenging or weird, even though I do think the spacier tones of the latter two are generally really likable. And yes, while lyrics have never mattered all that much to Deep Purple, you can also tell that this band is getting closer to their cranky curmudgeon side that was starting to come out on their last project, and while the sarcasm and nothing at all kinda worked for me, songs like No Need to Shout and Drop the Weapon, they are the sort of undercooked attempts at saying something or just not wanting to hear anything that feel utterly tired. But then again, half the band is in their 70s, and they still play really well together. Their legacy is long secured, and hell, if they want to take another victory lap, it's fine, just less interesting than last time. So, strong 6 out of 10, only for the fans. Next up, from Glass Animals, Dreamland.
Slipping through dreamland like a torrent, pulling down pine trees deep in your head.
I remember there being so much hype around Glass Animals back when I was getting requests for them in 2016. They were perceived as having a unique sound and vibe, this dank, quasi-voyeuristic tone overladen with detail and psychedelic distortion, but really going back to How to Be a Human Being 4 years later, not only does it not feel as weird or kooky thanks to a sonic palette that stripped away a lot of the atmosphere of their debut, but also because there's an odd hollowness to a lot of their approach that just does not stick for me. A lot of deflection in highlighting the unkempt weirdness of humanity around them, but not much in the way of commentary or punch beyond very surface level reflections, which I'll say it, artists like Ariel Pink just do better at this point. But now on Dreamland, well, it's a lot of the same trick as last time, but somehow I like it significantly less now that he set his own target on his own millennial nostalgia. Now, let me stress, this guy's about my age, and there is some overlap when it comes to late 90s, early 2000s nostalgia, going back to your childhood with adult eyes and realizing the plastic sheen of it all was not all that it was cracked up to be. Rina Sawayama exposed some of this on her debut this year, and it was great. The problem is that frontman Dave Bailey gets to all the cultural detritus, but very little of the insight. Again! If anything, it's worse this time around because his husky Tom York with the vocal pry approach, it feels gummy and way too close in the mix. Not helped by all the vocal filters, which just sound really tinny and gross. And the sound is this predominantly Californicated psychedelic texture left over from Kevin Parker and a blend of hip-hop and trap beats. I wish I was kidding on that part, but hell, even Denzel Curry shows up on Tokyo Drifting, and he's easily the most dynamic part of the entire album, even if he really cannot save that song. Look, my problem is that this is the exact sort of project to make passing commentary on getting mired in nostalgia or trying way too hard to be cool, but then it's just gonna go do it all anyway, and the motivations for it feel flimsy as all hell. I'd argue the biggest thing that separates his kitschy over-reliance on references from what AJR and Owl City got crucified for was going for the humid, festival-ready mono-genre, and yet if you don't care about lyrics, I could maybe see that being enough. But what's frustrating is that amidst all the undercooked and frequently asinine writing, and some of the questionable vocals, or how completely stupid Melon and the Coconut is, there are some decent grooves and slightly more grounded human scenes, especially on the back half of the album, with cuts like It's Also Incredibly Loud, even if that song doesn't live up to its title. I just wish there had been a consistent focus there rather than all the goopy psychedelia that just feels really derivative and tedious. And I can't help but hear a really ugly twinge for a guy to try to do the ironic hip-hop nod in 2020, and doing it so often that one of the better songs here, Your Love Deja Vu, owes a lot to early Justin Timberlake. Glad we woke up from that dream. Probably should leave this dream behind as well. For me, it's a strong 3 out of 10. Honestly, it's kind of generous. Next up from Aminé, Limbo.
Shimmy, y'all niggas get no applause. I'm looking like wealth, so mommy want a menage. Y'all niggas really hating, get off my dick and my balls.
So I'll be frank, I kind of missed the boat with Aminé in 2017. I heard Caroline, I was kind of lukewarm on it. I kind of got the impression that his carefree flow and demeanor didn't quite do enough to pave over some questionable writing, and I moved on. And while a lot of that is still true, I eventually went back to hear more, and I found a decent bit that I liked. Mostly in that he was a bit more of a creative and ambitious writer and performer than I had given him credit. Even if he did have a dickish streak right under the radar that did kind of bug me and prevent me from loving his work. So yeah, I'm happy about getting a chance to talk about him now, and well, Limbo is a surprisingly apt title. Because while you can tell that Aminé is a little bit less carefree, the death of Kobe Bryant in particular, you can tell hit him hard, it's more because he's in a weird transitional space, but at least he's able to bring a bit more of his wit and creativity to bear. And that sense of missed expectations leads to some pretty sober songs on the back half of the album, from the tribute to his mother to how Becky has him dump his white girlfriend who just isn't making all the effort to understand the current climate, to how when we will get the song where after bragging of success, he starts finding the little joys that he winds up enjoying more than the usual trappings of being a successful rapper. That grapefruit skit on the very end of Fetus with Injury Reserve and his comedian friend Jack Knight, that was great. I really appreciated the timing there. The only other guests, they mostly acquit themselves well. I like the shared verse from Slow Tie and Vince Staples. JID delivered once again. Summer Walker has, frankly, better chemistry with Aminé than she has with most people, and she actually sounds pretty good against some of the slightly rougher, organic, if overmixed production. But granted, so does Aminé, who chooses to sing a fair bit more, and his vocal timbre is just textured and slightly off enough to actually work for me. Now, if I've got complaints, they do come in some of the, once again, rough vocal mixing. I know the production, it's trying to go for a little bit more of that organic, textured feel with some warmer samples, but at least in comparison, when it comes to the questionable trap pivots, I will appreciate the warmer stuff, but the vocals could still sound a lot better. And how while he is taking some steps towards maturity and slightly deeper content, like a flashier but moodier YBN Corday, I'm still not quite sure he got all the way there while preserving all the exuberance and the wild hooks that made songs like Wedding Crashers so infectious. But hey, to make the YBN Corday comparison again, there's enough thoughtful potential and an eye for interesting production to make me intrigued to hear more, so yeah, light 7 out of 10. It's not something I'm going to revisit often, but for the summer, this was a good listen. Check it out. Next up from Marlowe, Marlowe 2.
You would never see that. Use the trap though. Chop it up with ya, like I really mean it. I don't keep still, I just take the scene.
I stand by 2018's Marlowe as a pretty underrated hip-hop album. The textured kaleidoscope of samples that Larange provided gave just enough kooky energy to Solemn Brigham to ride effectively. And while the album did eventually feel like he was writing himself into a corner, throwing out as many tricks as he possibly could to hold on to your attention, is also kind of the thematic point and was supported by the production samples. But enough critics had the feeling that Solemn Brigham could push himself beyond just great flows and into more introspective content, which is why I have to wonder why they don't bother with that critique for so many trap artists they will heap praise upon. But hey, Marlowe 2 looked to be a tighter, more refined experience. And you know what? It is, but I also think it might be considered a lateral move more than an outright improvement across the board, as I don't quite love this as much as I was really hoping that I would. Now, partially this is because for Solemn Brigham taking more steps to expand and diversify his flows while keeping his careening nasal flair, we are still on very much of a similar arc to the first Marlowe album, where our frontman will double down on a mad scientist, lone hustler mold, and then will lead you deeper as far as you might dare to to go. I think he knows that his greatest strength as a rapper comes in his technical showmanship in terms of flow and melody, rather than a lot of storytelling or unique lyrical detail. But like with the first Marlowe album, there's more beneath the lines, and he shows off more dimensions surrounding that exasperated rat race, which leads to a sequel interlude where his Carnival Barker character gets all his exhibits repoed, only for him to protest that they really aren't all that special. I appreciate the self-awareness there. But Solomon Brigham also has 3 new tricks up his sleeve tied to his relationship with his audience. 1, the artifice works to help him, and you actually feel something in the art. Number 2, it's not like his hustle is all that different than anyone else's, so why throw unnecessary judgments when you could both target that oppressive system? But most importantly, you followed him down this rabbit hole in the first place, and ergo, you're probably not all that far removed from where he is, so why not find a bit of solidarity in the weirdness? And there's a nice bit of odd comfort in that. But okay, if there is advancement there, why call this a lateral movement? Well, that might actually be tied to L'Orange, to my surprise. I said this with my first Marlowe project, that a lot of his sample-rich production had a tendency to overwhelm his collaborators, which, I'll be blunt, that's been my issue with his Jeremiah J collaborations. And thus, I think he might have tried to pull back a bit, give Solomon Brigham a little bit more space to breathe and shine, but L'Orange may have overcorrected here, as many of his samples feel a little bit more muffled and lacking some of the same wild kookiness of the first Marlowe. Ironically, I just don't feel the album is quite as colorful. And while there are some great moments like the shuddering guitars on Small Business, the bassy Royal with the splashy horns on Future Power Sources, the Marlowe 1-esque Sawdust Underground, and then you got some of that terrific creaking bounce of Same Team, and you know what, even a few of the wonkier interludes, I'm just not quite sure that they hit that perfect balance point just yet. I think there's more potential to be mined here. But as such, light 8 out of 10, definitely recommended as some great hip-hop in a year that's been pretty quiet on that front. But again, still more room to grow. I want to hear more. And finally, from Luke Bryan, born here, live here, die here.
Make him 10 feet tall with a southern drawl and a crooked smile if you can.
Really, at this point, after the past decade, is there much more to say about Luke Bryan, especially when he's still sticking to a mostly working formula and hasn't figured out the problems that have been endemic on his albums for years now? This will be the 4th time I reviewed his work, and while I can say this is probably one of his better projects in recent memory, it still has a lot of the rampant issues of the past several years. The percussion is way too clunky, often programmed and overemphasized in the mix, especially all the filmy cymbals which just fill up all the available space instead of actual any melodic tone. Then you have the vocal mixing is really inconsistent and often compressed, and while the mix is a little bit warmer, courtesy of some more country tones, and even a fair amount of pedal steel, you get the gummy or spacious synth mixing that is chasing an atmosphere that, quite frankly, Dierks Bentley abandoned when it didn't work for him in 2016. And what gets distracting is that a lot of this is the same issues that have plagued Luke Bryan's work for years. When he's trying to double down on the rustic, down-home sentiments that can thrive off more organic texture, the obvious overproduction, the emphasizing that he's a Nashville product, well, it just feels off, that artificiality, not helped by how jerky some of his writing can be. And that's kind of a shame because Luke Bryan is still a pretty decent singer, and the back half of this album, trying to incorporate some more sensitive and introspective moments, even if songs like Build Me a Daddy are kind of really heavy-handed in their sentimentality, but they aren't bad. I actually kind of like the more understated implications of For a Boat, at least a bit more there. Now, granted, the writing is still mostly slide towards a lot of forgettable, very mainstream Nashville country cliches, which leaves me in the odd position with Luke Bryan. This album is considerably shorter than his past couple projects, and the singles, that run has been pretty long, which gives me the impression that this release feels more out of obligation to the label rather than a major push. And yet, for as successful as Luke Bryan has been, you'd think he would have the clout at this point to be able to make the same big artistic throw in like Brett Eldridge or Randy Houser have in recent years, or like Eric Church has done for the past decade. But as it is, look, it's far from his worst, but man, I'm gonna forget this in record time. 5 out of 10, just for the fans at this point. and even then he's done better. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Again, this was a long episode, but there's a reason for that. I'm going on vacation next week. In other words, On the Pulse will still likely come out, but it might be late, or it'll be chopped up in a different way. You'll have to see what happens, what that'll look like. Likely to be a little more handheld as well. But if you want to get involved in my scheduling process for all this, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, tough times, do not feel any obligation, but if you want to, there you can go. Beyond that, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.